Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the podcast. Your support is crucial, and the best way you can do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Geopolitics and Empire Substack. A little over $9 a month, or a little over $90 a year. We do private weekly group Zoom chats every week or two to shoot the breeze in current events. I do a weekly roundup, an analysis of the news, providing my commentary, and sometimes ripping back past podcast guests for a live Q&A with supporters only. You can donate through DonorBox, Wise, Crypto, Buy Me a Coffee. That's all over at the website, geopoliticsandempire.com. You can purchase a consult if you want to chat with me about anything, and do check out all of my awesome affiliates. You've got Gabriel Custodiet's Escape the Technocracy course, which is fantastic. If you purchase the course, I've taken it. I get a commission. Wise Wolf Gold, Above Phone for de-Googled phones, EasyDNS.com, Societatis Civis, and so forth. And leave a podcast review if you haven't already. Returning to the podcast is Richard Poe to discuss his awesome new book. I've got the digital version here, How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. It's been a little over 3 years since we last spoke. Welcome back, Richard.
Thanks, Savoya. Great to be back.
It's great to have you. I love your work. As always, just finished the book yesterday. Highly recommend it. Go out and buy it, the physical version or the digital. If we just want to start, what brought you to write this book, and tell us a bit about the thesis before we dig into some of the details.
Well, I've had a lifelong interest in the topic of the Russian Revolution and especially the Russian Civil War, simply because my grandparents lived through that. My father's parents were Jews of the former Russian Empire, and they both left their homeland in the early 20s. So they had lived through the full horror of the Russian Civil War. And they didn't talk about it much. We were encouraged not to ask them questions about that subject. And it was kind of I would almost describe it as a taboo in my family, saying, oh, they had terrible experiences, they don't like to talk about it, and this kind of thing. And so there was this air of mystery about it, and which intrigued me all the more. And what sorts of things did they really experience, and what was it really all about? And as I grew older, and I became very interested in Russian history and language. I studied Russian. I studied briefly in the Soviet Union. Did a summer session at the University of Leningrad. And the more deeply I got into Russian studies, the more I realized that the mystery of the Russian Civil War was not just something in my family, it was something very deep all throughout historiography of that part of the world, that the war was not well explained. And what was especially not well explained was, why did the Bolsheviks win? How did they actually manage to win? And in my book, I call the Russian Civil War the Vietnam before Vietnam, because it has many of the same aspects where you had a communist insurgency or a communist enemy, which by all logic and reason should never have been able to win against such overwhelming odds, and yet somehow they did. And what I discovered is that in the Russian Civil War, as in our own experience with the Vietnam War, what really happened there is that in the case of Vietnam, our leadership really didn't want to win. And I'm old enough to remember those days and to remember the frustration of feeling somehow that our leaders were really deliberately not winning the war. And I think that was generally felt by most Americans. And so it's very interesting to discover now through my latest research that communism at its very inception, at least the first communist state, the Soviet Union, was born out of the same sort of deliberate catastrophe. Deliberate in the sense that the British in particular, who were really in charge of the whole supposedly counter-revolutionary effort, supposedly supporting the White Russians to overthrow the Bolsheviks, that the British actually betrayed them in many of the same ways that America later betrayed Vietnam. And while the British actually had every physical ability, they had the power, they had the position, they had the right circumstances at that time, roughly 1918 through 1922. The British War Office, which was basically running the whole Allied effort, supposedly against the Bolsheviks, it was fully within their power to establish any sort of government in Russia that they wanted to. And this is the real point of my book, because the government that the British allowed to take power ultimately was the Bolshevik government. And they didn't have to do that. They had a clear choice. They could have established the white leader, Admiral Kolchak, who was very successful at one point, and they deliberately pushed him aside because he wouldn't play the game, as Prime Minister Lloyd George put it. And the game meant cooperating with Britain's imperial ambitions in the region. That what Great Britain wanted to do, and eventually succeeded in doing, was to break up the Russian Empire into small pieces, into its constituent parts, the different ethnic groups with their ethnic homelands. And so while the Russian Civil War was raging, and while Winston Churchill, as war secretary, was personally in charge of Britain's support of the White Russian war effort, and not just the White Russians, but also the various separatist groups, the Poles, the Finns, the Baltic states. During those years of the Russian Civil War, several major parts of the Russian Empire declared their independence, and in many cases fought very hard for their independence, especially Poland. Poland actually invaded Russia to seize even more territory after they declared their independence. So the British were helping all of these independence movements and supporting them, and had been for years. But they were also supposedly supporting the White Russians, and they were covertly supporting the Bolsheviks, which is one of the more interesting points that I discussed in my book. So they were basically supporting all sides against each other and managing this process for their own purposes. And what they wanted, what the British wanted, was to have the area basically under their control. They wanted to have access to the oil in the Caucasus. They wanted to have non-interference from any Russian government in their activities in what was then called Persia, because Trotsky, who was a British agent, and I can discuss that in a bit, Trotsky was actually an agent of the British intelligence. And when he was installed as foreign commissar, one of the first things he did was to unilaterally renounce all of Russia's interests in what we now call Iran. Russia had previously, by agreement with Great Britain, they had effectively partitioned Iran, or they called it Persia then, into a northern half and a southern half. The Russians had the northern half in their sphere of influence. The British had the southern half. And sometime around then, it's not clear what year exactly, but I think there's some misinformation as to when the oil was discovered. But sometime during that period when Russia and England were dividing up Persia, supposedly they suddenly discovered oil. I think they must have known it was already there, which is why they were dividing up the country. But this was the first great oil strike of the Middle East. This was the discovery that turned the Middle East from an area that was mainly important because of trade routes to an area that was suddenly important because of resources, because it was a great source of petroleum just at a moment when the technology of the world was turning towards a petroleum-based technology, and especially the technology of war. And so it was extremely valuable. And Russia had the North, Great Britain had the South. Within days of the Bolshevik Revolution, Trotsky, whom I think I established was a British agent, he named himself, I think the very next day, after the coup of November 7th, 1917, I think the next day, Trotsky appointed himself foreign commissar, and within a very short time, he renounced all Russian claims to the northern part of Iran, leaving it for the British to take. The British essentially became the masters of Iran, then called Persia, and exercised complete control over all the Persian oil, which again was the only Middle Eastern oil that was known at that time. And the company, the British company which got control of that oil, was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Today it's known as British Petroleum. So that great petroleum development company, British Petroleum, literally was the gift of Leon Trotsky to Great Britain. And it was the great war prize of World War I for the British. It was more valuable than anything else they gained through that long and terrible war. And at least in the eyes of British elites, it was well worth the trouble. And I show in my book that sponsoring the Bolshevik Revolution and allowing the Bolsheviks to win, after allowing Russia to go through this several years of civil war in which 10 million people died, this whole process, which was managed and orchestrated by the British War Office, led directly to the British acquiring the resources to found what is now British Petroleum. And so it was in the annals of war and geopolitics, all the stuff that your show is about, a prize of this magnitude would be more than sufficient to justify all the bloodshed and all the suffering that the British inflicted upon the Russian people, at least in the eyes of British elites. But they gained a great deal more, as I argue in my book. And so, well, before I go into that, I was going to speak then to the British motivations. You have any question before I launch into that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, I very much enjoyed your book. It's one of the books that once you start reading it, you want to finish it to the end. It's very well written and sourced. And, myself being a former history major and teacher professor of history, what I notice these days, you touch on this in your book, how we're sold a lot of mainstream history, right? You mentioned in your book how, and we can get to that, how the British started rewriting history, establishing a certain narrative that was then passed down to us. And now, part of the reason podcasts have exploded is because we are rewriting history again. And I think oftentimes we can use the same sources, but for example, what you do in your book is you create another narrative using good sources. And then when I'm reading this and you're pointing out, like, here's the evidence that with these British royalty and politicians and lords in their own statements, confirming what you're sort of the narrative that you're shaping. And you talk about, for example, in World War I, the Gallipoli campaign that was deliberately sabotaged, and how they used, British double and triple agents to sort of get their agenda through, which part of it was resources, as you mentioned, and again, Trotsky as British agent. I'm just curious, one thing that came into my mind, what would have been the motivation for someone like Trotsky? Because I think if I were a true ideologue or revolutionary and wanted to be pure, to whatever my revolution is, whether it's Marxist or a conservative revolution or something, I wouldn't want to be tainted by other influences. So do you think Trotsky was just some sort of, you mentioned he was narcissist. Was he just an opportunist? Did he really believe in Marxism? And or did he think working for the British would have helped his cause, or just your thought on that?
Well, I present evidence which I think is quite compelling that not only Trotsky, but basically all of the top Bolsheviks were very consciously conspiring with the British government from possibly as early as 1902. Lenin was first in London in 1902, and he came with Trotsky and I think Stalin at that time, and various other top Bolsheviks. They came several times to London to meet with high-level British operatives of the British government and of the British so-called Round Table movement. So in answer to your question, how did they perceive what they were doing? I think it was impossible for them to miss the fact that they were colluding with the British government. They were. And in Trotsky's case, he may have perhaps been more compromised than most for various reasons. One of which is that he was having a love affair with Claire Sheridan, a British spy who happened to be Winston Churchill's first cousin. That's just one of the many curious facts about Trotsky that when you put them all together, the evidence is just overwhelming that he was a spy. And in his case, in Trotsky's case, almost uniquely, he was actually put on trial by Stalin. He was tried for treason, and he was tried specifically he was accused of being an agent of British intelligence. And he was found guilty in absentia. This was in the late 30s, and Trotsky was already out of the country. But he was tried, found guilty, and condemned in absentia. Not too long after that, he was assassinated in Mexico in 1940, and perhaps this was the long arm of Soviet justice. I don't know exactly why Stalin presumably ordered the hit on Trotsky, but he had been condemned as a traitor and specifically as an agent of British intelligence. And in that trial, the chief witness against him was a Soviet diplomat named Christian Rakovsky, who confessed that he himself had been recruited by MI6 while in London, that the British had confronted him with some kind of forged letter that incriminated him, and blackmailed him through the use of this letter into agreeing to work for them. So Rakovsky then testified years later before the Soviet treason tribunal that he suspected Trotsky had set him up. He went back to Moscow, and according to Rakovsky's testimony, he confronted Trotsky with what had happened in London, and Trotsky, he claims, admitted that he was working with British intelligence. He admitted that they had set him up with a forged letter, and then he had simply told him, from now on, you and I are working for British intelligence. So this is testimony in a Soviet show trial. It's obviously not 100% reliable. They did use torture and things like that. But still, it's quite a bit of this evidence that was brought against Trotsky can be corroborated through other sources, and not just through the testimony in that trial. And so basically, just to give you a kind of checklist or rundown, why do I say, excuse me, why do I say that Trotsky was a British agent? Well, he was with Lenin and other Bolshevik leaders making multiple journeys to London to meet with British operatives in London, starting as early as 1902. Perhaps more importantly and more damningly, after the Tsar was forced to step down in March of 1917. Trotsky immediately, he and some of his colleagues got on a ship to go back to Russia to help lead the revolution. They were arrested in Halifax by the British authorities, by MI6, by MI5 actually. And Trotsky was put in a Canadian internment camp for a month. And then MI6 intervened in the person of one Sir William Wiseman, who was at the time the station chief in charge of British foreign intelligence in the United States. He intervened with the MI5 authorities who had arrested Trotsky and arranged for him to be released, him and his comrades, put on a boat and given safe passage back to Russia, where they became decisively important leaders in the revolution. So the release of Trotsky has never been explained to anyone's satisfaction. Why this was done, it was most definitely done at the direct behest of the station chief of MI6 in the United States. Beyond that, we can only speculate. Well, we only have various official stories and fallback positions and limited hangout narratives, none of which make much sense. The only thing that really does make sense is they wanted Trotsky there in Russia to do what he did. Now, the other thing about Trotsky is, as I mentioned, he did after being released by MI6 and basically sent back to Russia to lead the revolution. He was surrounded by a number of British handlers, one of whom was the woman I mentioned, Claire Sheridan, who is known to have been a British agent, although she pretended to be a Bolshevik sympathizer. She was a sculptress, and she managed to make her way through the Bolshevik leadership and to socialize with them and possibly to have affairs with some of them. She certainly had an affair with Trotsky. That much is admitted, at least in her autobiography. She admits that Trotsky was he was flirting with her, and at one point she says he grabbed her and gave her what she calls a passionate kiss, whereupon the narrative kind of fades away and she leaves the rest to your imagination. But she admitted that much, and it was widely rumored she was having an affair with him. And it is known that she was a British agent, and she was the first cousin of Winston Churchill, and very close to him. She wasn't just any first cousin. She was the one person in Churchill's family that he was most close to. They were very good friends and confidants. So that's another odd connection. Now, another thing that Trotsky did that's very suspicious is that he personally invited the British fleet to land at Murmansk in 1918. He actually granted them permission to land their ships and to land troops, kicking off the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. And there is really no good explanation as to why he did that, other than he must have been instructed to do so, because it certainly didn't help the Bolsheviks to bring in all these Allied armies, although actually maybe it did in reality, but Trotsky didn't know that. And so this is another one of these historical myths that you were talking about, and how we now have to begin reconsidering so many things that have been part of the canon of Western historiography. So this Allied intervention, in which basically all of the Allied countries of World War I landed troops in Russia for the supposed purpose of crushing the Bolshevik Revolution and supposedly installing the white Russian counter-revolutionaries in their place. This was not just a myth of history that this happened, but it was, I would call it the founding myth of the Soviet state. Because what the Soviets said is that after their revolution, which was basically a coup that happened in one night, November 7th, 1917, they basically only had control over two cities, Moscow and what was then called Petrograd. But somehow they had to get control of the entire landmass of the Russian Empire, and they had to fight for that in a civil war of 4 or 5 years in which 10 million people died. That's the total on both sides. And so how did they accomplish this? I mean, how did they do it? And in addition, the way the Soviet propagandists used to describe this, they said the whole world came against them. Every imperialist nation, as they put it, sent armies to try to destroy them, in addition to the armies of the white nationalists, the white Russian nationalists, and the various armies of the separatists, such as the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Finns and the Baltic states and certain Caucasian states. So all of these armies, which at one point vastly overwhelmed in numbers the Bolshevik forces, at one point, I think this was towards the end of 1918, there was a point where the Bolsheviks basically just had Petrograd and Moscow and a small area in the very center of Russia. They were totally surrounded, overwhelmingly outnumbered by these armies, both domestic and foreign. And their leader, who had been appointed commander-in-chief of their armed forces, Leon Trotsky, had zero military experience. He had never served in any armed force, nor had any training or instruction in military affairs, and yet he was put at the head of the Bolshevik forces. And so somehow, through this long 4 or 5 years of civil war, 10 million people killed, somehow Trotsky supposedly overwhelmed and overcame all of these professional armies from the most powerful armies, countries in the world, the victors of World War I, who stood supreme in the world at that time. They were the rulers of the world, and this is basically Great Britain and her allies, and especially her most powerful ally, her new ally, the United States of America. So the British put about 60,000 men in the field in the Russian Civil War. The Americans, only about 13,000. But the Japanese, I think, had about 300,000, and there were a lot of Allied troops there. So how did the Bolsheviks manage to win? And the only explanation, and the one that I think I have proved definitively in my book, is that the British deliberately allowed them to win. Lloyd George, the prime minister, is on record. There are written records of statements that he made to his war cabinet, and even public statements where he very clearly said that he did not support the agenda of the white Russian nationalists. He called them reactionaries. He said he did not want a military reactionary government taking power in Russia. Surprisingly, Lloyd George did not even want a liberal constitutional monarchy in Russia. And that had supposedly been the very thing that the British were pushing for, which started the whole revolution in the first place. You know, it all began early in 1917, where Lord Alfred Milner, who was then war secretary, made a special trip to Russia to give an ultimatum to Tsar Nicholas II, basically telling him, you need to surrender your traditional autocratic powers and become a constitutional monarch right now and share power with the Duma, which was the Russian parliament at that time. And this right in the middle of a war in which Russia was facing an existential threat from foreign enemies and was losing terribly, was in full retreat. And Lord Milner was telling the Tsar, you must democratize. You must choose this moment to democratize and basically shed your power in favor of the Duma. Now, the reason Milner wanted the Tsar to do that is that the British controlled the Duma. The Duma was filled with agents of influence of the British Foreign Office and British intelligence. And Tsar Nicholas was aware of that too, and he was also aware that Milner was giving him very bad advice on purpose, because the Allies, France and England, had done exactly the opposite. And rather than democratizing, they had both established wartime forms of government that were extremely authoritarian, and some said dictatorial. And the Germans had done the same thing. They actually established what has been called a military dictatorship for the period of the war, in which Generals Ludendorff and Field Marshal Hindenburg shared power basically as military dictators. So while all of the belligerents in World War I, including those who deemed themselves democracies, were actually turning towards authoritarian methods of governing themselves, at least for the duration of the war, they were going to the Tsar and saying, you must choose this time to democratize, and right in the middle of the war. So it was an extremely unreasonable request. And it wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum, because Lord Milner, who was also the head of the British Round Table, which I'd mentioned earlier, he actually gave an ultimatum to the Tsar. He told him that if he failed to do what he was being instructed to do, that he would be ousted, that there would be revolution, and that England would not help him to stay on his throne. And in fact, England was not only didn't help him, but they actively caused the revolution. That is the February Revolution that first overthrew the Tsar, then followed a few months later by the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, we have very good testimony about this from a Princess Palais, who was a very high-ranking member of the Russian royal family. Her husband was the uncle of one of the uncles of the Tsar. His name was Paul, the Grand Duke Paul, and so he was the son of Tsar Alexander II, and therefore the brother of Tsar Alexander III, who was Nicholas's father. So he was the uncle of the Tsar, a Grand Duke, a very high-ranking and influential member of the royal family, and his wife, this Princess Palais, she survived and ended up in exile in Paris. None of the rest of her family survived. They were all slaughtered by the Bolsheviks. Her husband, her son, her stepson, they were all killed. There was actually a concerted effort by the Bolsheviks to deliberately exterminate the Romanov line. And I argue in my book that this bloody agenda was not unwelcomed by the British. And there was a reason why they let the Bolsheviks get away with this. In the case of Tsar Nicholas, they could have stopped it, because there was a point before the Bolshevik Revolution when Kerensky's government was holding the Tsar and his family, where there actually was an opportunity to get the Tsar and his family to England, and the British government said no. And specifically, King George V said no, who was the first cousin of Tsar Nicholas II. And why did they say no? Because, as I argue in my book, they had a deep and bitter and long-standing rivalry. That is, the British ruling classes had a deep rivalry with the Russian Empire, going back centuries to the time when Russia first emerged on the world stage as a great power. The British were against them and saw them as a rival for control of the eastern trade routes, which was so vital to Britain's ambitions. That is, the Suez Canal, what ultimately became the Suez Canal. But even before that, the trade routes generally leading to India, China, all these places where the British had extremely vital interests. And Russia was sitting right there athwart these trade routes and harboring similar ambitions to rule the region. So this led to a rivalry between them, which the British called the Great Game. They saw it as a great game of trying to outmaneuver the Russian bear, not only in the matter of India. This great game is often said to be referring specifically to trying to keep the Russians out of India, but it really was for the whole kit and caboodle of what Queen Victoria called world dominion. And this is one of the reasons I love history and I love reading old primary sources, because you get to read people saying things without a smidgen of wokeness. Because while today we talk about world peace, or we talk about even a word like globalism, well, Queen Victoria would never utter a word like globalism. She said, quite frankly, that the trouble between Britain and Russia was a contest to see who would gain world dominion, as she put it. It was a yes.
Just on that point, I mean, you mentioned these names like Milner, and I recall some 15, 20 years ago, me going down the rabbit hole and first reading Cecil Rhodes and Milner. If I remember some of the other names like Lord Lothian, I might be mistaken, Philip Kerr. I think I've got some of their old books on my bookshelf here. And you know, even before I read your book, it was making sense because, you know, I talked to a lot of folks like the LaRoucheites and others, and I don't agree with all of their stuff, but there does seem to be still to this day a lot of what you've described that happened a century ago. It's still continuing on. I mean, when you look at, you know, it's the American and British sphere today openly again in their own papers saying they want to dismember Russia. You read the Rand Corporation reports. And then a lot of the activities that are going on in this NATO expansion and attack on Russia. I mean, just this week, they took out Lieutenant Kirillov. He was the guy that came out and said, look, COVID was started by, you know, the the Americans, and for the purpose, basically, of creating world government. That's what Kirillov said, that they launched COVID to bring about global governance, which was my thesis in March of 2020. I stated that on a podcast. And he was just assassinated, and the spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, said it was the British. And then all of these different assassinations, the Russians today keep saying it was the British. And so for me, it's making a lot of sense that one of the prime seats of global power to this day are the British. And I sort of view, my lens of viewing history is a bit biblical as well, where I see the Roman Empire sort of just moved to Britain. So it's like, I view it all as one still Roman Empire in a sense, where you have Roman Empire, British Empire, American Empire. They recreated the European Empire, which is the EU. The EU is an empire. And so it's still like this one Western blob. And if I could get to your, and what you said earlier, you know, Anthony Sutton adds to your research. Anthony Sutton mentions how the West, Americans, British, continued financing the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union to prop them up. He says the best enemy the money can buy. And even if you think today, any revolution or rebels, they need supplies or they're just not going to survive. So when you think about ISIS or Al-Qaeda today, they wouldn't exist. I mean, I remember a quote from an Iraqi general years back saying, he literally said, look, if the West stopped financing ISIS, they wouldn't exist tomorrow, right? And so whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda who are being used, or the Bolsheviks, or any rebel group, you mentioned that in your book with the whites, in the whites in Russia, and their funding was pulled and it was game over. Just as you mentioned, if we could get to your second key point in the book. So we're talking about the British, and then you talk about invented communism. This is the big, the nuclear topic here that irritates a lot of people. There's someone I became a fan of recently, Mark Passio. He's a former Satanist, former occultist, and now he's speaking out against it. And he uses the phrase occultocracy to describe how this ruling elites are a combo of factions, that they are occult at their core. And yes, there are different factions. There's Jesuits, there's Freemasons, which you mentioned in your book. There's a Zionist Jewish faction. There's other, dynasties and factions. That's how I view the world, that this elite is composed of different factions working together. They're a moneyed class. They go back centuries, some of them. Others are, have newly joined, and they have this sort of occult power ideology. And some people say it's the Jews, right? It's the Jews. I just wanted to read. I got an email. I did a podcast on Latin America not long ago, and someone, I don't know if I brought up the Jews or something in the podcast, but someone emails me, one of my listeners says, when were the first Holocaust extermination camps, right? It's kind of like the meme, nobody, and it's like, it's the Jews, right? And so I don't subscribe to that. I'm a Slav, so I'm a Untermensch. I mean, even the Nazis in their own writings say my people were going to be used for labor and extermination. My grandpa was a prisoner of the Croatian Nazi regime. And so just to get on the whole communist thing, I believe it's an occultocracy. You mentioned in your book, you talk about the Illuminati, the German Bavarian Illuminati, the French Jacobins. Then people talk about the protocols of the elders of Zion, the Enlightenment. And again, Mark Passio, former Satanist, he gave an excellent 8-hour lecture explaining how communism and Nazism, and I think his work joins with yours. He says that these were basically these occult secret societies that put Marx up to this. And you talk about in your book how it was the British, right, who could have been, Freemasonry involved as well, who put Marx up to a lot of this stuff. So just the whole communist angle, then, if you will.
Sure. The funny thing is, those people who don't like my book, and it does make some people very upset, usually because they read the title and they haven't read any other part of it. The title is How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. And I'll just take this moment to inject a little shameless self-promotion by showing the book. But so how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews. The two concepts that people find preposterous, many people find ridiculous, hard to understand. It's really very simple. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, aren't you aware that Karl Marx was Jewish? Are you not familiar with that fact?" Well, yes, obviously, I discuss Karl Marx quite a bit in my book. I discuss his Jewishness, I discuss his politics, and I discuss his very intimate and peculiar relationship with British intelligence and the ways in which he served the British Empire and the ways in which he was manipulated to do so. But basically, Karl Marx didn't invent communism. So, you have to let go of certain historical myths just to even understand what I'm saying, because Karl Marx didn't even claim to have invented communism. He never even said that he did. He and Engels both acknowledged that a guy named Babeuf, one of the French revolutionaries, they acknowledged him as the first modern communist. And he was executed sometime around 1792, I think, and Karl Marx was born in 1818. So the birth of communism, the birth of what is recognizably modern communist ideology in its most recognizable form, as acknowledged by Marx and Engels themselves, was clearly the streets of Paris during the French Revolution, and specifically a group called the Conspiracy of Equals, led by this guy who called himself Gracchus Babeuf. He named himself after the Gracchi, the Gracchus brothers of ancient Rome. And this Babeuf was himself recruited and deeply under the influence of known and identifiable British agents. He was part of a larger phenomenon in the French Revolution where British reformers, British socialists, British people who were presenting themselves as being comrades, wanting to come to France and to help their French comrades to make a revolution. Many, if not most, of these British friends of the revolution were actually British intelligence operatives, or somehow acting under the influence of British intelligence. And so this is a phenomenon we see again and again throughout modern history, is that London became the Mecca for revolutionaries in exile. And just as Karl Marx came and brought his family there in 1849, after he'd been kicked out of a few other countries in Europe because of his subversive activities, he finally found a refuge in London, and he stayed there for the rest of his life. Many other revolutionaries made that same journey, going back to the days of the French Revolution and before it. And so the British allowed this and encouraged this because they wanted to gather all these revolutionaries in London where they could watch them, reach out to them, get to know them, befriend them, and then pick out those whom they felt were useful and recruitable, and recruit them into being agents of influence, who in many cases would be sent back to their home countries to make revolutions or to help cause various sorts of destabilization operations. So the British mastered this art very early of recruiting revolutionaries and manipulating and orchestrating revolutions, to the extent that I say in my book that the British were actually the inventors of what we now call color revolution, and that the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and indeed the revolutions of 1848 were all color revolutions, as we would call them today, and all led from London. They were British-led, British-inspired color revolutions, which basically means a fake revolution which appears to be a popular uprising of the people, but is actually a destabilization operation, a regime change operation perpetrated usually by a foreign intelligence service, in this case the British. And I argue further that this ability to, in a sense, overthrow any government they want without taking the blame for it, to almost be able to act invisibly at will throughout the world, bringing down governments and making it appear that their own people brought them down. That this was the great secret weapon of the British Empire, more even than their great naval fleet, more than their financial power, their exercise through the Bank of England, which could generate unlimited funds for their imperial operations. Conventional historians would tell you that the British Empire was built on naval power and financial power, but even more than this, I believe it was built on the power of covert operations, on the special skill that British intelligence acquired for creating color revolutions and enabling them to simply take out any government that was getting in their way. And it was for this reason, I believe, that the age of revolution that we speak of, beginning in the 18th or a late 18th century, maybe going to the early 19th century, the years of revolution that we call the age of revolution, this was precisely the time period when the British Empire rose to become the global hegemon, physically controlling 1/4 of the Earth's surface and financially and through other means really controlling arguably the entire Earth. And
if I could just pause there, I think this is another strong point of your argument, because I was going to ask, why so much focus on the British? Why your focus and others on the British? And if you just step back and look at a map of the world and step outside of history for a second, and you see, which regions of the world are most developed, have the most capital, the most power? It's not Latin America. It's not Africa. It's not Asia. It's Britain. It's Europe and Britain. And why? Because they're the most organized, the most developed. They have most of the capital, which enables them to carry out so many of these activities, not just the Navy, but what you mentioned, the color revolution aspect. And looking back now, it makes perfect sense, because what we're witnessing today, the first iteration was the French, the French Revolution, and all of these other revolutions. And I wrote my master's thesis on the color revolutions, and I tried to examine places that were not, everyone knows in Serbia in 2000 was like one of the first modern color revolutions, and then was it Ukraine, getting the years wrong, but the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, I think, no, it was Georgia Rose Revolution 2003, Saakashvili 2004, Orange Revolution in Ukraine, so on and so forth. I lived in Mongolia, and it was funny. Elbig Dorj, who was the former president of Mongolia, who's now an elder he's part of the globalists, the elders. In 1990, in Mongolia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Elbig Dorj was a young man who created a Liberty Institute, which was financed by Open Society, State Department, USAID, usual suspects. Saakashvili in Georgia opened the Liberty Institute, also financed by the same actors. And then Mongolia had like a Red Rose Revolution in the 90s. And so, again, Mongolia went through a lot of that. And so getting back to my point, that for me, it just makes perfect sense that there's this clear line from, as you mentioned, these sort of British influenced revolutions in the 1800s still to this day. And even when I was living in Kazakhstan from 2017 to 2020, I came across my students, high school students, who were part of this process, that they were carrying out extracurricular activities with these NGOs in rural Kazakhstan. My student showed me a certificate in Cyrillic that she got from the National Endowment for Democracy. And when I saw that, I was like, whoa, I literally came face to face with this beast. And I told my higher ups, and then the head of the internal security in the city took me out to lunch. He spoke perfect English because of the stuff that I was talking about, and it's got such a far reach, even to this date. I mean, on the ground in rural Kazakhstan, these color revolutions are taking place. And I warned the government. This was from 2017 to 2020, and then in January of 2022, they attempted a color revolution in Kazakhstan, which failed. And so I'm just, just my point here is that it makes perfect sense for me that Britain, is the seat of all of this. It might, for some of the people listening that viewed things differently, it might not only be the British, but I feel them as one of the major power brokers, and that can be in conjunction with other groups from around the world.
Well, yes, and I think you raised a very important and central point there, which is when I speak of the British role in creating globalism and still in, I believe, leading the globalist movement today, if you might call it a movement, this is very hard for people to understand for the very simple reason that we have been told that America is the leader of the world and that nobody tells America what to do and that America is pursuing its own agenda. And the corollary of that is that all of the evil in the world is being perpetrated by America and was conceived by America. And this is one of the reasons why this is an important subject for me to explore, because as an American, I feel that what really happened is sometime during the administration of Woodrow Wilson, actually, arguably, you could say during Teddy Roosevelt's administration, he actually made a secret alliance with the British, but things really came to a head with Woodrow Wilson, where, excuse me.
Right. He, you mentioned in your book, and a lot of people are aware that he had a handler, Colonel Mendel House. And when I was in Geneva, actually, as a grad student, I would go to the old League of Nations building, which is now the UN Geneva, and I would go to the library, and I took out a copy of Mendel House's book and would be reading it there, at the old League of Nations building.
Well, that must have been eerie. Yeah. House was a very mysterious and controversial figure. He had a Svengali-like hold over Woodrow Wilson's mind that some people attribute to hypnotism or some occult power. I don't go into any such speculations as that, but he clearly controlled Wilson in a way that's a little puzzling and mysterious, and to an extent that's very hard to explain. But the other thing is that this House was a British agent, and you can read all kinds of, alternative history books, conspiracy books, and they'll always mention Colonel House, and often they'll say he worked for the Jews, or they'll say he worked for the Rothschilds, or he worked for this, or he worked for that. They never, ever say that he worked for the British, and yet he did. He was a British agent. His father came from, and his parents were both British. They came to the United States, went to Texas. His father became very rich doing business in Texas, but then during the Civil War, his father had a fleet of blockade runners. He was a major blockade runner for the Confederacy and for England, which was sponsoring the Confederacy. And I touch on that in my book as well. But so this Colonel House's father was a British agent. He was running Confederate cotton to England and bringing back British arms to arm the Confederates. And he got very rich doing that, and was very helpful to the British war effort because they were basically running the Confederates. Something a lot of people don't know. But so his father, Colonel House's father, made sure that all of his sons attended English boarding schools, because even though he lived in Texas, he wanted them to have a British education so they would know where their true loyalties lay. And later on, his son, who became Colonel Mendel House, became a very good friend with Sir William Weisman, the same one who released Trotsky when he was arrested in 1917. So this Weisman, I guess it's pronounced, he came to the U.S., I think it was around 1916, around there. It was during World War I, but he became very friendly and some say intimate with Colonel House. A lot of biographies speak of the extraordinary warmth and intimacy of their relationship in ways which are almost suggestive of that they were lovers. You run into these kinds of descriptions which seem to be hinting at that, but I've never found any solid evidence of that. But this Wiseman apparently lived in the same apartment building as House, and they were close friends, and they befriended Woodrow Wilson and even went on vacations with him. And so essentially British agent House invited British agent Wiseman into the closest circle of Woodrow Wilson, gained his confidence, and meanwhile, House was regularly corresponding with the British Foreign Office, discussing with them what they wanted to do and how to get President Wilson to do it. And so, and this returns to your question, Evoya, about, well, why talk about the British? Isn't America really the great power in the world? And I would say that a lot of the perception we have that America has somehow created the globalist world that we live in today, that this was an American initiative. I think a lot of that it comes from British propaganda, because the British from the beginning wanted to hide behind the U.S. They wanted to be shielded by the U.S., and they wanted the world to see the U.S. as the one that was pushing these globalist agendas, such as the League of Nations and the extremely unpopular terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and so many policies that followed World War One. They wanted America to be blamed for all of these things, and they actively went out of their way to create a situation where America would be blamed. And here, for example, we find the same team: Colonel House, William Wiseman, and Sir Edward Grey, who was I forget what they called it, the equivalent of our Secretary of State. I forget what they call it in Britain, but that's this guy, Sir Edward Grey, occupied that position. He was the foreign minister, basically. And he wrote to Wiseman and said to him, we want to start this thing called the League of Nations, but we think it would be much better received by the world coming from an American president. Would your president, Woodrow Wilson, be willing to introduce this idea to the world and pretend it was his idea? And Colonel House said, yes, I think that can be arranged. Let me work on that. And that's exactly what happened. Wilson not only proposed the idea for the League of Nations, but he literally pretended it was his idea, exactly as he was instructed to do by the British Foreign Office and the various British agents who were surrounding Wilson. So right there at the very inception was the beginning of this pattern that we have seen throughout the 20th and I would say into the 21st century, where the British are setting the goal that the whole idea of global government was really theirs from the beginning. They were talking about this way back at the beginning of the 19th century, but they wanted people to think it was the Americans who were behind it. And so the essence of globalism, as I understand it from my research, is basically a plan to establish British hegemony over the world, using the United States as the muscle, as the global policeman to enforce this order, and that it was the British plan from the beginning to retain control over imperial policy in this new reinvented version of the British Empire, which we now call globalism or the UN system, or whatever you want to call it. Or some like to call it the American Empire, or they like to call it the Pax Americana. So I think that the British are the originators. It was they who invented the form of global government that we have today. It was they who pushed it. It was they who identified the United States of America as being the key to making this whole plan work. They knew they had to get the Americans on board, and they used and they penetrated the Wilson White House with their intelligence operatives to make sure that Wilson got on board and did what he was supposed to do. And this British intelligence activity in the United States, these influence networks, British influence networks, whose purpose is to keep the Americans in line with the agenda of the British Foreign Office and British globalism as they conceive it.
I want to explore this just a bit further. And again, I think it should be obvious that, as you mentioned, the ideas for globalism and world government, I mean, in some ways, I can say they've been there throughout all of history, but in just the past couple centuries, explicitly, I think you're correct. It's coming out of the British realm because, H.G. Wells, Cecil Rhodes, they are the ones openly, expressly in their own writings saying we need a world government based on the British Commonwealth. So we've got that in writing. And then you had the Royal Institute, you mentioned that in your book, the Royal Institute of International Affairs was created. And then the American version, CFR, was created. That's another tell right there. There was first the British, then they created the American version. And I view it sort of as like a beast, right? It's the British, and then they just add on the American government or empire and anyone else that they can add on to this beast that they're creating for global domination. I've had on the podcast one of the former directors of the Royal Institute, Victor Bulmer Thomas, and I've had on the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, Mark Leonard. And just to go to look at something you mentioned in your book, sort of, I think, what was one of the purposes, of course, it's world government. You talk about this group called Young England in your book. You write, quote, "The specific forms of socialism Toynbee and Milner approved were those which would protect rather than threaten the position of Britain's ancient aristocracy in accordance with the agenda of Young England." And basically, you talk about Webster. What's her name? Is it Nora Webster? I'm forgetting her first name.
Nesta Webster.
Nesta Webster. Yeah. And I only recently came across her, maybe like a month or two ago, and I was going to bookmark some of her writings and read them. People can go to Internet Archive and download the old books. But they were trying to make the Young England group were trying to make a case for a return to feudalism. And again, this for me sounds exactly like World Economic Forum's Great Reset, which I, for the past few years, have been saying the Great Reset project is to wipe out the middle class and to create neo-feudalism. And you look again, where is ground zero for the implementation of these policies? It's England. The 15-minute cities, the ULEZ, low emission zones, net zero, which I call death zero, the cutting of the pensions, the coronavirus, the crown virus, right? Again, the League of Nations. So again, there's just so much evidence right now that's still pointing to England. So just your thoughts on Young England, this desire to bring back feudalism, which eerily it sounds, from 200 years ago, it literally sounds like Klaus Schwab's Great Reset.
Right. Well, I want to, before I go into the Young England thing, I just want to say that the British origin of the World Economic Forum is even more explicit, I think, than what you just said, because it was a direct project of the British Round Table. And this, for this discovery, I have to thank Johnny Vedmore, a UK journalist, and also Sean Stone, who
both, by the way, have been guests on the podcast. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. And so, as you know, Sean wrote a book called The World Order, I think it was called, or The New World Order, that was all about this very subject, the influence of the Round Table on globalism. And he identified a man named William Yandell Elliott as having been Kissinger's mentor, and this Elliott, he was an American, but a Rhodes Scholar and an early member of the British Round Table, of the American branch of it. So Stone recognized that in his book, which I think came out in 2012. And it's interesting that Niall Ferguson subsequently did a biography of Kissinger, which I think came out in 2015, where he went into great depth about this relationship with William Yandell Elliott. And a lot of people are saying, wow, that's really interesting. We never heard of this Eliot before. We never knew the influence he had on Kissinger. And so it got noticed when Niall Ferguson wrote about it. But his book came out a few years after Stone's book, and I wouldn't be surprised if Ferguson was influenced by Stone, because Stone really got it first. An amazing book by Sean Stone. But so Stone, he figured out that this William Yandell Eliot had mentored Kissinger, and then Johnny Vedmore figured out that Kissinger had mentored Klaus Schwab, and actually. It was both Kissinger and Yandell Eliot, because Eliot was still alive, and so they both working together. They recruited Klaus Schwab in, I think it was the late 60s or early 70s. Probably the year 1969 is coming to mind, or it could have been earlier, 67. I don't remember. But by 1970, that is, Klaus Schwab came to Harvard and he participated in this basically CIA-funded program. It was called the Harvard Summer Seminar, International Summer Seminars. And the very purpose of this group was to recruit apostles for the Round Table agenda, that is, the globalist agenda, whose origin lay in the British Round Table movement. And so that is, Kissinger and Eliot recruited Klaus Schwab, and they helped him start the precursor of the World Economic Forum in 1971. It was started as early as that.
I think it was called the European Management Forum or something, and then it's
something innocuous sounding like that. But it was the same group. It was just a name, underwent a name change later. But here's the thing. So these men, every single one of them, were members of the British Round Table movement or its equivalent at that late date. The Milner's Round Table no longer existed, let's say, by the 1940s, but it still went on through the institutions it created, such as Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations, etc. But the really interesting thing that we know now, because of this sort of intellectual lineage that Stone and Vedmore put together, we now see there was a direct line of mentorship from Lord Alfred Milner, who was the putative founder of the Round Table movement, which used to be the Rhodes movement, which used to be the Ruskin movement, etc. But Milner supposedly created this thing, at least under its name of Round Table. He was the founder of it. And then he mentored a guy named Lindsay, who was an Oxford Don, I think a philosopher. And Lindsay mentored William Yandell Eliot, who then went back to the United States, mentored Kissinger, who mentored Klaus Schwab. So there was a direct line of mentorship from Lord Alfred Milner in London to Klaus Schwab through this specifically British influence network, whose very purpose was to recruit promising young people into the Round Table network, into the Round Table frame of mind, which was the ideology of British globalism. And what is the ideology of British globalism? It's sometimes known as liberal imperialism. They began calling it that in the late 19th century. It is the philosophy that says liberal nations, those who have liberal democracy, liberal democratic governments, have the right and the duty to conquer all the rest of the world and in order to spread liberalism. And this is called liberal imperialism. And it is embraced quite frankly by Alfred Milner and his generation, and so on. So this lineage, just to say that was, it was very, very direct, that the World Economic Forum is a direct project of the same influence network that we call the Round Table, in previous years. And I'm afraid I went so far down rabbit hole. I forgot what your question was.
Well, I mean, no, that's the fun part of this. I just want to add my own thesis is studying world government, global government, governance, the world state. I mean, in their own writings, H.G. Wells and the others explicitly say they are democratic socialists and they want a democratic world, the democratic socialist world state, more like a Fabian version. And kind of, I think you touch on this in your book. It's like they want this democratic socialist Fabian type of system, not so much communist, or more it's like for the plebes it's going to be a feudal system where we get the communism and socialism, meanwhile they get to live like the aristocracy, and they want every nation on earth to become a liberal democracy because they invisibly manage all of these democracies. So it's a facade where we think we're voting, we think we're protesting. No, I mean, we're seeing it now. In Georgia, they tried another second color revolution in Georgia, which has failed for now. The president doesn't want to step down. She's born in France. She's, EU remote controlled Romania, right? So they just cancel any democratic election that they don't like and just redo it again. And I view, because they ultimately want a world federation made up of 190 plus democracies, which they all control. And I don't think you could really have a world state or government any other way. You couldn't have a world, in totality, a world empire created out of monarchies, because they're never going to, work together. So that's why one of the reasons of the Illuminist Jacobin revolutions was to do away with religion and monarchies and dynasties and create these new models of democracies, which can cover all the nations of the world. And then you can, like a puzzle, put them into this world federation. Just any thought on that?
Well, that's a very intriguing thought. I hadn't really thought of it in that way. That from a purely utilitarian point of view, maybe monarchy, the old world that existed before 1914, with all these royal families ruling empires in Europe, maybe that wasn't maybe somehow by its nature, it wasn't conducive to the kind of global empire that the British globalists wanted to establish. Ultimately, I don't, I don't go that deeply into the ultimate motivations, just because I'm not sure. You mentioned the occultocracy before, and I know there are a lot of secret societies and occult groups involved in all this. I'm not yet prepared to say what their role is in the whole mix. But I will say this. Now, you asked about the Young England movement before, and of this I am very sure. The Young England movement was a movement of British landed aristocrats, which emerged in the 1830s and 1840s as a reaction to the abuses and of the industrial age and the growing anger and frustration of the working classes, who were coming to the cities en masse, abandoning their familiar life in the countryside, and finding themselves basically being worked to death in factories and mines, under terrible conditions, long hours, women and children being forced by their circumstances to work these kinds of hours and under terrible conditions. So the conditions of the Industrial Revolution and the hardships that the workers faced was a real thing. And the anger that they felt and the dissatisfaction and the revolutionary potential in that situation was very real. And the ruling classes were acutely aware of it. They were acutely aware this was not sustainable, that people were not happy, and that revolution was brewing. And so the Young England movement emerged in England because England was the first country to industrialize. They had the first industrial revolution. It was in full swing by the 1830s, and they had experienced first the full efflorescence of these social problems that were being created. And so Young England came forward as a movement and said, we, the landed aristocrats, have a solution to this. We'll go back to feudalism, because under feudalism, you didn't have to work so hard. You went out to the fields, you did a farmer's work, and then you came home, and you had a sane life, in the countryside, a sustainable, workable life, and you lived under the protection of your landlord, of the great lord who owned your land and essentially owned you, and that in this condition of serfdom, that life was actually better. And more particularly, that it was argued that the aristocrats somehow, on an almost spiritual level, that they were good people and that they had a paternal interest in the welfare of the lower classes, that they loved them, in fact, and cared for them in the same way they cared for their hounds or their horses, that they would never let anything bad happen to them, and that if the aristocracy were restored as the great power in the land, things would not be so bad. And they blamed the abuses of the industrial age on the greed of the newly rich, of the middle class, of the bourgeoisie, as they were sometimes called. And they said that these are newcomers. They don't have our aristocratic ideas of noblesse oblige. They don't understand the responsibilities that we have towards caring for the poor. And that's why they abuse the poor so badly, because they're greedy and all they care about is money. Whereas we aristocrats don't care about money because we inherited all our money. And so we have a different value system. So what is interesting about Young England is that in order to push this program, and the program was expressly to go back to a feudal system, it was saying this industrial revolution has led us into a hellish circumstance. Let's go back to feudalism. And in doing so, the Young Englanders, these aristocrats, made alliance with communists and socialists in England and worked with them and said and helped push their programs. And so they pushed a lot of socialist programs into law in the parliament very early in England. And, and things, not always necessarily socialist, but things like shortening working hours, relieving the conditions of child labor, women's labor, establishing the poorhouse system, which was supposedly for the good of the poor, things like that, which were conceived of as enlightened social policies to help the poor. And they worked, the Young England aristocrats worked directly with the top revolutionary firebrands of that day, including Karl Marx. So Karl Marx came to England in 1849, supposedly at the end of the Young England era, but it was still going on. The Young England movement, so-called in Parliament, supposedly had disbanded. But the attitude that the landed aristocracy should lead the people to a return to feudalism continued to live on. The spirit of Young England, the ideology of Young England, and I believe still lives on to this day through the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, and groups like that. But so when Marx came to England, when he moved there with his family, he was very soon sort of adopted. He received the patronage of a man named David Urquhart, a very wealthy Scottish aristocrat of the high nobility of Scotland, who was I don't know if he is officially called a young Englander in the history books, but he certainly shared their ideology in that he wrote a book which argued that England should be turned to feudalism. He had exactly the same argument as the Young Englanders. And this David Urquhart was also a soldier, a diplomat, and a secret agent. He had been involved in covert operations for the British government in the Caucasus, for example, stirring up rebellion against Russia. And he had served in the Greek Revolution. He had served as a diplomat at the court of the Sultan in Constantinople. He was a deep state guy. He was a diplomat and a secret agent, and no bones about it. And so this man recruited Karl Marx. He took him under his wing, and he gave him sponsorship and patronage. He opened doors for him. He introduced him to people, and it was directly due to David Urquhart that Marx was able to become one of the most prominent journalists of his day. He wrote for newspapers published by David Urquhart himself, but also for Horace Greeley's paper in New York, which was the biggest circulation newspaper in the world at that time. And what he primarily wrote about Marx was not Marxism, the Marxist revolution. What he primarily did was act as a propagandist for British imperial interests, often disguising it as arguments for socialism or communism or social justice or whatever. But his favorite subject was the same as David Urquhart's favorite subject. Urquhart hated Russia. He had a very deep hatred of Russia as an enemy, and so deep that he publicly accused the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, of being a paid Russian agent, an agent of the Tsar, simply because he felt he was too soft on the Russians. And so Marx actually followed this line, including even the accusation against Lord Palmerston. There are many, many writings of Marx that are just basically British Foreign Office propaganda.
If I could just go, I had that in my notes here, and I was just kind of amazed at how, I mean, Marx was towing the line of British foreign policy. Like he could, that speech could have been from today. You write in your book, quote, "At times, however, the illusion wore thin and Marx's voice resounded with the unmistakable tones of British Foreign Office propaganda. For instance, in an 1867 speech to the International's General Council, Marx accused Russia of seeking world domination and demanded an independent Poland as a buffer against aggression. In the first place, the policy of Russia is changeless," said Marx. "Its methods, its tactics, its maneuvers may change, but the polar star of its policy, world domination, is a fixed star. There is but one alternative for Europe, either Asiatic barbarism under Muscovite direction, or else it must reestablish Poland, thus putting 20 million heroes between itself and Asia and gaining a breathing spell for the accomplishment of its social regeneration." Again, just to step back, it's like you mentioned this in your book as well. I think that the people talking like this are actually projecting themselves. And, you know, I'm no fan of communism or socialism or the Kremlin. I view, you know, the Kremlin as a corrupt oligarchy, you know, just as in Washington or Brussels or London, the same, right? But looking at it objectively, I don't see them. Russia today is not, or maybe even back then, as expansionist as the British and the Americans and the Europeans. And so it's just kind of like it doesn't square what he's saying, I think. So,
well, the Russians certainly weren't anywhere near as successful in their expansion as Great Britain at the time, or France, or even the United States. To me, it's not, you know, I don't look at it in terms of good guys and bad guys. You know, I just try to look at it dispassionately as a realist. As an American, though, I do have a particular sensitivity to what I deem as the false narrative that America somehow had been the inventor and the leading cheerleader of globalism. I see no evidence of that whatsoever. On the contrary.
Could we, speaking of narratives, go back to the Jewish question, which we haven't tackled as much. Early on in your book, you talk about the protocols of the elders of Zion. My thing is, with a lot of these books like this, the content for me has proved accurate. Like these plans, whether it's the protocols or other books, what is stated there seems to be what's being carried out across the centuries. You mentioned the Young England group, which today is like the Great Reset. So the question is, who's the source behind this? You later talk about the historical cover-up by the British involvement in the Russian Revolution, where they start writing about how it's the Jews. You write, quote, according to this theory, German Illuminati infiltrated Masonic lodges in France and Germany during the 18th century, infecting them with satanic doctrines, later portrayed as Jewish doctrines, which would ultimately evolve into communism. This is the Judeo-Masonic theory of communist origins, an idea which would later figure prominently in Nazi and fascist ideology. The degree to which British intelligence services contributed to the formulation of this theory is a topic most historians have neglected. And you go on, you talk about how, whereas in many cases the stories they circulated were true or partly true, but they exhibited a persistent and predictable bias, having been skewed in such a way as to deflect attention from British intelligence operations. I view as the content, a lot of it true. You talk about Baruel's book, that the Bavarian Illuminati were the hidden instigators of the French Revolution. They aimed to build a satanic world order on the ruins of Christendom. And finally, that they disguised their satanic agenda beneath a veneer of good intentions, preaching liberty, equality, fraternity. For example, I believe that what they're trying to do, whoever it is, that is true, but I don't, believe it's the Jews. And, a lot of the people today, the other thing that gets me, almost very few, or if not any, of the people today who are saying it's the Jews, they are sympathizers of the Nazis or Hitler. I rarely get someone who focuses a lot on the Jews who is also anti-Hitler and anti-Nazi. And I think it's clear that there's nothing good from Hitler or Nazism. And just your sort of thought, I think it's clear that there is a Zionist faction that's powerful, but to say that they run everything, I just see it as a hard sell. Just any further final thought on the place of Jews in all this today?
Well, sure. The thing is, now you just read that quote from my book talking about Marx gave a speech. This was in the 1860s when he was leading the First International, and he was speaking against the evil of Russia, the expansionism of Russia, and he was saying, let's support the Polish rebels. And let's put millions of heroes between us and Europe and the barbarian Russians. Now, the Jewish question in all this is very similar to the Polish question. And let's see if I can explain this in a simple way. See, a lot of people, when they see my book, they say, "Oh, you're just covering up for the Jews." Everyone knows Marx was Jewish, and a lot of top Bolsheviks were Jewish, and have you read Solzhenitsyn's book and blah, blah, blah. And the thing is, in my book, right at the outset, I acknowledge, I basically concede the point that, yes, of course, the Bolshevik movement was disproportionately Jewish. There's no question about it. I concede the point up front, because there's, to me, that's not important to what I'm trying to write about. Because the British, in overthrowing the Russian Empire, they had to use a lot of different ethnic groups to do different tasks. And they used the Jews because the Jews were a very large, powerful, in some quarters wealthy, influential group within the Russian Empire who were deeply aggrieved against the Tsarist government for their own reasons, and very open to working with some foreign power to overthrow the government. And why they adhered to Bolshevism in particular, that's a complicated subject, which is worthy of discussion, but not very important for the purposes of my book, because what I know is for each different ethnic group that the British used and encouraged, they all had their own history, they all had their own character, they all had their own culture, and they all had their own unique set of grievances against the Russian government. And it didn't really matter. Each one had its own grievances, and for the British, who were simply employing a classic divide and conquer strategy, it was simply a question of approaching each and every ethnic group that had a grievance and promising them, we will help you if you help us. We will help you because we are trying to bring down this Russian empire, this Russian imperial government. And in the chaos that follows, you will get what you want. And so the Poles are a very good example of that, because Poland was basically finished after they were, I forget what year this happened, but Poland was divided into three parts. The Germans got one part, the Austrians got one part, and the Russians got the lion's share. They got most of it. And at that point, there was no coming back for the Poles. There was, without help from some great power, from some external force, they were gone. They were never going to come back from it. Three of the mightiest empires in the world, each with a piece of Poland. How are they going to get out of that? Well, the British went in there, and with the help of their faithful allies, the French, and they began doing covert operations in Poland, and they instigated rebellions in Poland, and they led and orchestrated them. And so in the 1860s, they launched a big rebellion in Poland, which was heavily supported covertly and overtly from England and France. And they had Marx and other talking heads agitating propagandistically, telling people about these heroic Polish freedom fighters and how wonderful they are. And the fact is, they did it. They created this Polish rebellion. Part of it was because of their long-term strategy against the Tsarist regime in general, but they also did it for an immediate reason, because the Russians were helping Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. The British had sided with the Confederates. The Tsar sided with Lincoln. And so the British were trying to negotiate with the Tsar and get him to come over to their side against Lincoln and join them in a diplomatic offensive to force Lincoln to accept separation of North and South. And so to apply pressure on Russia, they were instigating these Poles to rebel. And it was a very bloody rebellion. A lot of people got killed. And the British continued instigating the Poles, arming them, supplying them, and making promises to them, until in 1918, Poland finally declared independence, went to war with Russia, invaded Russia. They didn't just free those territories that were traditionally Polish. They invaded Belarus and other areas that were not traditionally Polish, simply to grab as much territory as they could. And so this is the type of thing that the British did with each and every ethnic group that they encountered in the former Russian Empire. They went to each group and said, what do you want? What's your grievance? We will help you. Same thing with the Finns. They got independence. The Baltic states got independence. Ukraine And the Caucasus declared independence. They were then reconquered by the Red Army. And the Jews were simply one of these groups who had been identified as being useful to this British effort to literally dismantle and partition the Russian Empire in a divide and conquer strategy. So, so that's the thing. When you have ethnic groups in conflict with each other, that's an opportunity for outsiders to come in and use those conflicts for the larger purpose of destabilization and regime change. But what happened further, and the reason I felt this was worthy of a book in and of itself, this topic, is because while the Russian Civil War was still going on, Winston Churchill and basically the whole British government launched a propaganda offensive in 1919 and 1920, whose purpose was to blame the Jews for the Bolshevik Revolution and the Red Terror and the whole catastrophe of what had happened to Russia. And Churchill notoriously personally penned a lengthy article in a London newspaper it was in February 8th, 1920, where he basically said, he accused the Jews of having fomented the Bolshevik Revolution and all the horrors of the Red Terror. But he went further than that and said that actually Jews have essentially led and orchestrated every subversive movement in Europe, going all the way back to the French Revolution and the formation of the Bavarian Illuminati back in 1776. And he accused the Jews of being somehow uniquely subversive and uniquely expert in subversion, and of having a very long history going back 150 years or more from that date, 1920. And he portrayed the current chaos in Russia as being simply the latest incarnation, the latest explosion of this perennial Jewish penchant for destabilizing and subverting. And what I argue in my book, and I think I prove it actually, is that first of all, this propaganda, this anti-Jewish propaganda line was not simply an opinion of Winston Churchill that he was expressing. It was an official propaganda position of the British establishment that was put out in major newspapers and promoted very heavily by the official war propaganda apparatus of Great Britain in 1919 and 1920, during the very time when 60,000 British troops were on the ground in Russia, when millions of whites and reds were clashing in the Russian Civil War, and Great Britain was in charge of this whole process. And so this was a very provocative thing for the war secretary of the British Empire, who was personally responsible for this whole Russian theater of operations, to say it was the Jews who did it. And he did it for a calculated reason. He said not only are they responsible for what happened in Russia, but for all subversive movements going back to the 18th century. And what I argue is that Churchill and the British intelligence generally put this out as a cover story to distract attention from the fact that the British Empire, the British intelligence itself, was actually the leading perpetrator of these revolutions / color revolutions during that very time period that Churchill specified, beginning with the Bavarian Illuminati, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, the Russian Revolution. These were projects of British intelligence. And what I show in my book is that for a period of more than 200 years leading up to the present day, but beginning back in the 18th century, there was a concerted propaganda effort by British intelligence to actually create a conspiracy literature, especially after the French Revolution. There were some best-selling authors who were writing very popular books accusing the Illuminati and the Freemasons and other groups of launching the French Revolution in order to institute a satanic regime that would replace Christendom. And interestingly, nobody was accusing the Jews at that point of having been part of this. But I show in my book, and I name names of specific British operatives who were actually involved in planting and seeding the historical records with this kind of information about the Illuminati, about the Freemasons. And as you read in that quote, much of this information was true. I'm not saying that it's not true, but it's the way that it was used and the selective manner in which certain facts were emphasized and others were de-emphasized. And so what I showed is that the alternative media of that time, the equivalent of our Twitter-based influencers who are challenging the mainstream views, that they were just as much under the control of intelligence services as the mainstream news sources. And I think that remains true to this day. So British intelligence specifically was consciously and actively manipulating the conspiracy literature of the time to push certain agendas, one of which was to blame the Germans for everything. They initially, in the 18th century, they accused Frederick the Great of Germany, of Prussia, actually, of being the leading force behind the satanic subversion. And they accused him to the extent that certain Jews were helping him. They saw them as just Frederick the Great's sidekicks, as his agents. And so this is how the conspiracy literature of that time reflected the role of Jews. So what you can see is if you look from that time to the late 18th century, beginning, let's say, 1792, and then advancing forward 100 years or more into the time of World War I and thereafter, what you see is a continual intervention in the conspiracy theories, the conspiracy literature by British operatives manipulating it. And you can see beginning in the 1830s and 40s, 1844 was actually the big turning point with a novel called Coningsby by Benjamin Disraeli, who was then a member of Parliament, and who later became the first Prime Minister of England of Jewish descent. He actually I accuse him in my book of being part of this anti-Jewish British propaganda effort, because he, in his novel, actually, more than any other writer, put forth the modern model of modern anti-Semitism, which basically holds that Jews rule the world through the financial system, that Jewish bankers are more powerful than governments and therefore are the actual rulers of the world. Benjamin Disraeli wrote a popular novel putting forth this very idea. And to this day, anti-Semitic writers will rely upon this, and they will cite this novel, Coningsby, as what they deem to be proof that there must be a Jewish bankers conspiracy, a world Jewish conspiracy for global domination, because Benjamin Disraeli said it, and he was a Jew, so therefore it must be true. That's how the reasoning goes. What they don't consider is that Disraeli, well, first of all, he converted to Anglicanism when he was 12 years old, when his father converted. Technically, he wasn't Jewish, although I think he considered himself a Jew. But there are a lot of people in this story, like Benjamin Disraeli, like Karl Marx, and this goes back to an earlier question you asked, whom I believe showed by their actions that their loyalty to their own Jewish people was trumped, was upstaged by their desire to be accepted and rewarded by the British Empire, the greatest power in the world at that time, which had so many resources for rewarding them. Marx was given what he wanted, the ability to write all the books he wanted and be regarded as an important revolutionary hero in the world, even though he wasn't. And I think I showed in my book that he wasn't as advertised, but he was allowed to play that role as long as he served British intelligence. Likewise, Benjamin Disraeli, I think, made his devil's bargain. And he actually became prime minister. He was a favorite of Queen Victoria. He was made prime minister. He was given an earldom. He was given a great estate. And these are the things that he wanted. And he was actually considered a leader of this Young England movement early in his career. That is, Benjamin Disraeli, even though he was not at that time an aristocrat, but he was so consumed with his agenda of sucking up the aristocrats and serving them and being perceived as useful by them, that he was pushing their Young England agenda to return England to the feudal ages. And he was even regarded by some as the leader of this movement. Although that's a bit far-fetched. He sort of publicly promoted it, but the actual aristocrats who were part of the Young England movement, they never trusted Disraeli. They always saw him as an opportunist, as somebody who they sensed, that he was pushing the interests of the aristocracy simply as a way of currying favor with the titled classes. And so they always took a little bit of a dim view of him that way. And there was some truth, I think, in how they saw him. He was an opportunist, and one of the ways that he could serve the British establishment was by helping them with their agenda of putting out this cover story that the British Empire is secretly ruled by Jewish financiers behind the scenes, and even that all revolutionary subversion in the world comes from Jews. Benjamin Disraeli also said this in his book, Claiming to Be. Well, again, published in 1844. He actually predicts the rise of communism in that book and says that the Jews are behind it before it actually happened. He said there's a great revolutionary movement coming forth from Germany that is going to be like the new Reformation, and it's all Jews behind it. This was in 1844, and then in 1848, 4 years later, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came out with the Communist Manifesto, generally regarded as the great announcement of the world communist movement, though, of course, communism had already existed before. But when the Communist Manifesto came out, it was literally a fulfillment of Disraeli's prophecy from 4 years before. So here's this guy living at a time when Jews are just beginning to emerge, from the feudal constraints that were on them, beginning to achieve emancipation, as it's called. And he writes this book, and the book says, hey, all you Gentiles, you don't realize, but we Jews are actually running everything behind the scenes. And also, we're cooking up a communist revolution in Germany. Oh, boy, I can hardly wait. And so it was all there in his book. Why would he write that? Why would he write something that would bring such suspicion and opprobrium on his own people? Why would he do it? And I think this goes to the key of the whole part of the whole mystery as to why this narrative of it's all the Jews works so well is because there are so many Jews like Disraeli who will willingly participate in helping to create that illusion. Let's call it an illusion, in order for whatever rewards they get from, let's call them the ruling classes, whoever they ultimately are.
Yeah, I use an example. Mexico just got, I'm here in Mexico. I'm also proud Mexican naturalized citizen, and we have our first female president, also first Jewish president, Claudia Sheinbaum. She was born in Mexico, but she's of Jewish heritage or extraction. And I've got a lot of these conspiracy folks send me messages. Oh, you've got this Jewish president now. You're screwed. And I'm like, guys, you don't have a clue. Like the previous president, AMLO, was literally calling for world government and North American Union. And it's like, this Scheinbaum, it could have been anyone. It could have been one of the other Mexican candidates, and nothing would have changed. So just because she's in power doesn't change the program that's already been in play here. And just to go back, I feel like, we've got this project, this occult project for world domination, and they make partners, sometimes equal, sometimes not, of all these other groups. As you mentioned, the British made a deal with Jews. They gave them the Balfour Declaration. They gave them a state of Israel. You look at Saudi Arabia. This is the Saudi faction, right? They're full on Agenda 2030. They're building the prototype of Hunger Games, Maze Runner, the line in Saudi Arabia, right? So do the Saudis run the world? So they're on, all of these different groups around the world are being onboarded, and then any groups that aren't on board, well, they get wars and revolutions and financial collapses. In your book, what you said also, this conspiracy literature, it creates a fog. It creates a fog. It blurs a lot of stuff. And I've seen some people point out, I did a podcast on this in August, trutherism today, it's very occult, very new agey, and so I think there's something to that as well. And, as you mentioned, Disraeli, you mentioned William Guy Carr, who in the 2000s, when I first started down the rabbit hole, I came across all of these names, from Jones to John Coleman to William Guy Carr. I can't even remember them all. You mentioned how he was connected to British intelligence. He was a naval officer. You talk about, again, Nesta Webster. She protected British Freemasonry. She poo-pooed the other Freemasonry, but she never touched British Freemasonry. You say she was a propaganda asset for the British government. Her books were carefully contrived intelligence products. And there's other stuff in the book. You talk about the Simonini letter. I have a question for you on alternative media today, independent media. I think there's a lot of crazy, suspicious, strange stuff going on. I feel like a lot of these same dark forces have infiltrated the podcast space, the alternative media today. Do you have just any thought on alternative media today?
Well, just what I said before, that I think the alternative media is just as much of interest to intelligence agencies, to these official shapers of the narrative, to government censors, government propagandists, or their contractors. The alternative media is of just as much interest to them as mainstream media, or what we would consider, more official media. I think a lot of people now, it's sort of cool for people to know about things like MK Ultra and Operation Mockingbird, and people like to use these terms and show that they're sophisticated about knowing that intelligence agencies manipulate the media. And that's good. That's a step forward. But I think a lot of people are naive, and they don't realize that this manipulation extends to the alternative media, and it always has. And that's a big part of what I discuss in my book, is how British intelligence in particular were expressly targeting and manipulating alternative conspiracy literature in 1792 in order to shape the narrative of how the French Revolution happened, why it happened. And I think they're still doing the same thing today. And so a lot of times you'll see some influencer who says, oh, I've been deplatformed, I've been persecuted, I've been swatted, I've had some other terrible thing happen. And yes, these things happen to people. Often they happen organically. They just happen to somebody, and that's a terrible thing. Nobody should be subjected to that sort of harassment in a free society. But a lot of times I think what's going on is sheep tipping, which is that people are being subjected to apparent harassment simply to give them street cred, to make it look like they're being suppressed so that everyone will listen to them, when in fact they themselves may be plants. And it's very, very hard to explain this kind of thing to people. Most people, they're just too honest, they're too straightforward, and they just can't conceive of that level of cunning and that level of multi-layered deception. And the only thing I can compare it to is, I used to play chess when I was in junior high school and high school. I played a little tournament chess, and so when you're 14 years old and you want to be in the high school chess club, just to do that, I mean, you have to be able to think in terms of multi-layered deception in a very complex level. You have this board, and you have to think at least 20 steps ahead, and various different iterations and alternatives 20 steps ahead. At least you have to be able to think in terms of, I'm going to move here in order to make the other guy think that I'm doing this kind of attack, while actually I'm going to be doing this kind of attack. And he, on the other hand, is thinking, I'm going to make this guy think I'm doing this kind of defense when I'm really doing that kind of defense. And so here we are, let's say you're 14-year-old kids and you're playing this game and you're absolutely thinking, we joke about 4D chess, but 3D chess is bad enough. I mean, it's very, very complicated and very good exercise for the mind. But this is exactly the kind of thinking that intelligence agencies do as a matter of course. And it's really not that difficult. If a 14-year-old high school kid can do it, it's not that exotic. And yet for most people in normal life, trying to understand this,
Yeah, they don't understand the nature of evil. It's way beyond them. And I had a recent. I'm beginning to feel this more increasingly with the guests that get pitched to me. Agents, publishers, whoever pitch globalists to me, and I'll have some of them that I find interesting. One of the most recent ones that I declined, I won't name the name, but it was the head of some NGO, globalist NGO or foundation, and their mission was fact-checking and misinformation. And I'm like, I am the subject of your fact-checking and misinformation. And like literally, what would be the point of this person coming on? And I think what they're and they operate at multiple tiers, as you just explained. They're trying to get onto podcasts to influence me, to help me shape their narrative. And I see you guys coming from a mile away, really. So it's like I demand better psyops, and I think the audience is pretty good discerning. They can smell a rat from a mile away. I did also want to ask you, do you think that the history that you laid out, do you think the Russians or Putin are aware of this and they're just not talking about it? Have you ever thought about that? I'm just curious.
Well, I think the Russians are as aware as anybody else. I mean, there's always people who are looking at alternate theories of history. But I have to say, I'm not one of these Putin fanboys. There's a lot of these people out there. I don't know where it's coming from. This idea that Putin is the greatest guy in the world, the smartest, the best, and the Russians are going to save us, the Chinese are going to save us. That's ridiculous. There's no sign that they're any more enlightened than anyone else. I think at the best, what Trump said about China, I thought was very interesting when he was talking about the issue of trade war with China and, the tariffs and how unequal the situation was, that the balance of trade with China. And Trump said, I don't blame the Chinese. Remember when he said that? He said, they're just doing what's best for their own country. If we're stupid enough to offer them to put all this, basically to lead all our money into their economy through this disadvantageous tariff structure, if we're stupid enough to accept that, then of course, he said, if I were them, I'd accept it, right, from the stupid Americans. He said, I don't blame the Chinese for doing that. He said, I blame the Americans. So I blame the people in our own government who made this deal in the first place.
I forgot to bring this up. I had it in my notes here. At the end of your book, you briefly touch on, and I agree with you. You write Schwab and his WEF continue pushing the roundtable's perennial agenda of humbling America, this time under the banner of multipolarism, which seeks to replace an ostensibly U.S.-dominated world order with a new system revolving around the so-called BRICS states, among whom Russia, China, Brazil, India, and South Africa are supposedly paramount. It's interesting that now Russia is being pushed, and I point out how BRICS was coined by a World Economic Forum young global leader, as well as Goldman Sachs, and I don't buy the BRICS multipolar PSYOP. I see it as part somehow of this project of world federation, world government. Do you have any thought on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The BRICS thing was the whole thing started as a report from Goldman Sachs, right? And there was this British guy who was in charge of it, whose name I forgot.
Jim O'Neill, but most people omit that it wasn't just Jim O'Neill. It was this Indian lady, Paranutha or something, both of them. And she was also a young global leader. So
Right. I mean, and it's so the thing is so anti-American in its essence, and the thing that gets me about it, I mean, just aside from the fact that it's not good for America, and I don't think it's good for the world. And yes, it's obviously just another globalist scam. I mean, to me, that's what it seems like. But the thing that gets me is, I have spent a lot of years researching and writing about George Soros. And at one point, I I paid a lot of dues for that. I paid the price. My colleagues in the so-called conservative movement were not always supportive. When I exposed myself to the wrath of George Soros and his groups like Media Matters for America. And so it's very disconcerting to suddenly see all these people who purport to be pro-American and conservative, and they're pushing this idea that, we have to bring an end to the US dollar and the globalist American empire, blah, blah, blah. And I read all that stuff from George Soros. That's the kind of stuff he's been pushing in his book, The Alchemy of Finance, 1987. He pushed that agenda really, really hard, the de-dollarization agenda. And so I looked back over my whole life and my career, and I'm saying, if these are the good guys, was I wrong all along? Should we bring in George Soros before he dies and give him a medal and say, sorry, George, you were pro-American all along. You were right. We have to crush the United States, crush the US dollar and turn over all the power in the world to Russia and China and their friends. This is what George Soros used to push, and we used to call him anti-American for saying that. How did we get from here to there? Why is George Soros now right? And why are people who are claiming to be pro-American basically saying George Soros is right? How did we get there? I don't know. I mean, James Lindsay has this concept of the woke right. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. I don't quite understand exactly what it means, but he's on to something. He's on to something.
Yeah, we're under all these crazy operations. I mean, you got this MAGA communist thing going now. We have this American Communist Party that's been created by these, what's his name? The Finkel, I can't remember his name. It's on this young influencer who goes to Russia and Haas, forget his name. They just founded this American Communist Party, and so they're trying to merge. It's this synthesis, right, of American conservatism with this sort of globalist Marxism, which is just crazy. They're very good at what they're doing, and so we've covered a lot. Richard, I highly recommend the book. I also, there was just one last quote. There was an interesting section where you talk about this is not the place to debate the question of who really runs things in this world. You also talk about we have no way of knowing who the wealthiest people are, as wealth is routinely hidden in offshore trusts beneath layers of shell corporations. You do quote Daniel Cohalan, I think he's Irish, in 1919, where he says the real ruling force is the landed feudal aristocracy of England. Again, that's in the context of what we were talking about. But any other or final thought for us?
Well, I think that's a good place to end. That testimony, which was given to the U.S. Senate during the Versailles Treaty hearings by an Irish-American judge, Cohalan, I think it's pronounced. What he was saying is that he said he was testifying against joining the League of Nations and signing the Versailles Treaty because he said the whole thing was a British plot, and that what they were trying to, and he said, we were told we fought this war, World War I, to spread democracy and eliminate autocracy. But he said that England is the greatest, most powerful autocracy that has ever existed, and that it is not a democracy, that it is ruled by the same small group of men who have been ruling England since the time of Henry VIII, if not before. So essentially, he was saying it's an oligarchy disguised as a democracy. And he named the Cecil family as being, he accused them of being the actual power behind the throne at that time, which was 1919. So I would end it there because the question we have left unanswered in this interview is who really is in charge. If it's not the Jews, if it's not the evil Americans, the globalist American empire, if the source of the contagion really is somehow Great Britain, as I contend, well, most British people are very nice people. So who is really doing this? Who are these globalists? Who are these occultocrats, as you call them? And I just threw that in, the Cohalan's testimony to say there's a lot of contenders for that role that we've never even heard of, because the ones they keep putting in front of us all the time on Twitter or in all these books going back 200 years, the Jews, the Germans, this one or that one, the Russians, the ones they want us to think about, that they're always talking about, are, of course, always in our minds, always in front of our faces. But then this guy just walks into the U.S. Senate and says, we should be looking at the Cecil family. And nothing against the Cecils. I mean, if they're watching, nothing personal, but simply to say there are possibilities, there are theories, there are allegations, there are names that have been named that most of us never even heard of. because we're just being inundated by the low-hanging fruit, by the dominant propaganda themes. And we have to, if we're going to learn the truth, we have to get beyond the obvious and look at the less obvious. I guess that's my point.
Yeah, it's like the James Bond movies, Spectre, and I've maybe once or twice in my studies in Switzerland, which also took me to Italy, met Italian wealth, and these are people that you never would see or hear, and I think those are the true occult, centuries old financial oligarchies. And the Bill Gates, yes, sure, Bill Gates is a globalist, he's a eugenicist, he's a cog in the machine, but I think he's just like the outer layer of the onion, and they just have the power is so centralized and concentrated. We may never know, who's at the center of that onion. But again, highly recommend the book. All of your links are in the description, your X account, your website, your Substack, link to the book. And people can check out your past books. And as always, thanks for coming on the podcast, Richard.
Thank you, Boya. Pardon the self-promotion. Thank you.